It started with a flicker, a glint of light in the muddy water of a half-built sawmill. On January 24th, 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall, who was overseeing a project for his boss, John Sutter, reached into the freezing American River and pulled out a few shiny flakes. Now, Marshall wasn't a geologist, but he had a hunch. He smashed the flecks between two rocks and found they were malleable. They could be reshaped, but they wouldn't break. This wasn't fool's gold, the pyrite that had tricked so many others. This was the real deal. That one accidental discovery at Sutter's Mill was about to unleash a human tidal wave on California. And the timing? It was wild. The US had just taken control of the territory from Mexico after a war, and the treaty was being finalized just as Marshall found his gold. This triggered a global frenzy, a chaotic, desperate, and often brutal scramble for a fortune that seemed almost unimaginable. We all know the basic story of the 49ers looking for gold. But the true history of the gold rush isn't some simple tale of prospectors striking it rich. The real story, the one we tend to forget, is about radical transformation, unimaginable hardship, and the hidden costs that would forever scar the land and its people. It's the story of who really won the gold rush and the devastating price that was paid for every ounce of gold pulled from the earth. John Sutter, the wealthy landowner who had hired Marshall, was horrified when he heard the news. His big dream was to build an agricultural empire, a private colony he called New Switzerland. He knew a gold rush would completely shatter that vision. His workers would abandon the fields, squatters would overrun his lands, and chaos would destroy the orderly world he was trying to build. He and Marshall swore everyone at the mill to secrecy, but it was a hopeless attempt to contain the biggest news on the planet. You just can't keep a secret that big. News started to leak, first in whispers, then in a flood. But the man who really lit the fuse was a sharp and energetic entrepreneur named Samuel Brannan. Brannan owned a general store at Sutter's Fort, and after confirming the rumors for himself, he came up with a brilliant self-serving plan. First, he bought every pickaxe, shovel, and tin pan he could find in San Francisco. Then, he ran through the streets of the tiny port town, waving a bottle full of gold dust and shouting, "Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River!" The effect was instantaneous. San Francisco, which had been a sleepy town of just a few hundred people, emptied out almost overnight. The local newspaper, the Californian, had to shut down, printing a final notice that read, "The whole country resounds with the sordid cry of gold, gold, gold," while the field is left half-planted, the house half-built, and everything neglected but the manufacture of shovels and pickaxes. At first, it was just a local rush. But the news was spreading. By the summer of 1848, ships filled with hopeful miners began arriving from Oregon, Hawaii, Mexico, and even as far as Peru and Chile. Still, on the east coast of the United States, newspapers dismissed the reports as tall tales from the Wild West. That all changed on December 5th, 1848. In his State of the Union address, President James K. Polk officially announced the discovery to Congress, confirming that incredible wealth was being pulled from California's rivers. The spark had just become an inferno. The world was coming to California. They became known as the 49ers because the peak year of migration was 1849, when an estimated 90,000 people poured into California. This wasn't just a small move, it was one of the largest mass migrations in American history. In just a few years, California's non-native population exploded, rocketing from around 14,000 to over 220,000. These migrants were overwhelmingly young men from every corner of the globe. Americans from the East, plus tens of thousands of immigrants from Mexico, China, Australia, France, and all across Europe. Just getting there was a life-or-death gamble. There were three main routes, each with its own set of horrors. The longest was the 18,000-mile sea voyage around the tip of South America, a grueling trip that could take up to 8 months. Another option was the Panama shortcut. sail to the coast, trek through dense, disease-ridden jungles, and then hope to catch another ship on the Pacific side. A journey famous for cholera and malaria. Finally, you could take the Overland California Trail, a 2,000-mile odyssey across plains, deserts, and the towering Sierra Nevada mountains, where starvation, dehydration, and disease were constant threats. And for those who actually made it, they didn't find a welcoming committee. They found chaos. There were no real laws for property rights in the goldfields. A system of staking claims popped up, but it was enforced by the threat of violence, not by a judge. The miners lived in rough camps with names that said it all: Gougai, Drunkard's Bar, Whiskey Town. Most men slept in ragged tents or crude wooden shacks with no sanitation. Diseases like dysentery and scurvy ran wild. The dream of gold had brought them here, but the reality was a brutal fight for survival. This wasn't a settlement. It was a human tidal wave crashing against an unprepared shore, and the undertow was pulling thousands under. The classic image of the gold rush is a lucky prospector wading into a stream and pulling out a fortune. And that's the first, and maybe the biggest myth we need to bust. The truth is, the vast majority of miners found little more than backbreaking work and crushing disappointment. The easy-to-find gold, called placer gold, was gone almost immediately. The rest was buried deep in the earth, requiring organized teams and expensive machinery. For every one miner who struck it rich, 100 others spent all their money and broke their health for basically nothing. Most barely found enough gold to cover their ridiculously high daily expenses. A single egg could cost the equivalent of $50 today. A miner needed to find about an ounce of gold every single day just to break even. So, who really got rich? Not the guys swinging pickaxes. It was the merchants who sold them those pickaxes at an insane markup. While miners were freezing in streams, clever entrepreneurs were mining the miners. Samuel Brannan, the guy who started the frenzy, became California's first millionaire, not by digging, but by stocking his stores with supplies and selling them at a huge profit. His store near the gold fields could rake in the modern equivalent of $150,000 a day. Another smart businessman, a German merchant named Levi Strauss, saw that miners needed pants that wouldn't fall apart. He started making tough trousers out of denim, reinforced them with rivets, and built an empire that would outlast all the gold in California. The real winners didn't look for gold in the ground. They found it in the pockets of the men desperate enough to look. All this money and desperation led to absolute social chaos. San Francisco went from a village of a few hundred in 1846 to a lawless, sprawling city of 36,000 by 1852. These towns were filthy, crowded, and violent centers of gambling and drinking. With a massive gender imbalance, of the 40,000 people who arrived by sea in 1849, only 700 were women. Society's rules completely broke down. Without police, vigilante committees often took the law into their own hands, delivering brutal, on-the-spot justice. And this brings us to the darkest, most tragic part of the story. The gold rush wasn't a happy melting pot. It was a brutal clash of cultures. The flood of white American miners created an atmosphere of aggressive, violent racism. Foreigners were treated with suspicion, and Chinese miners, who arrived in large numbers, faced extreme discrimination. A foreign miners' tax was created specifically to drive Chinese and Latin American workers out of the gold fields. But no group suffered more than the native people of California. For them, the gold rush was an apocalypse. Before 1848, an estimated 150,000 Native Americans lived in the region. The arrival of the 49ers led to their systematic destruction. They were forced off their ancestral lands, their food sources were annihilated, and they were hunted and murdered in massacres that were actually encouraged by state-paid bounties. California's first governor, Peter Burnett, said in an open address, "A war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct." By 1900, fewer than 20,000 native people had survived this state-sanctioned genocide. This is the darkest, most deeply buried truth of the gold rush. The gold rush wasn't just a historical event. It was a turning point that forged a new America, leaving a complicated and messy legacy. The amount of wealth it generated was mind-boggling. By 1852, California was producing an estimated $81 million in gold a year, a sum that supercharged the U.S. economy and helped finance the Industrial Revolution. All that money and all those people fast-tracked California's path to statehood. It officially became the 31st state in 1850 as a free state, which upset the fragile political balance between North and South and pushed the nation one step closer to the Civil War. The gold rush also fueled the dream of a connected continent, providing the money and motivation for the first transcontinental railroad. But this progress came at a monumental environmental cost that's often ignored. Panning for gold was one thing, but as the easy pickings vanished, miners turned to destructive industrial techniques. The worst by far was hydraulic mining. This method used high-pressure water cannons to literally blast away entire hillsides to get to the gold. The environmental devastation was absolute. Miners washed an estimated 1.5 billion cubic yards of rock and debris, 8 times the amount of earth moved to build the Panama Canal, directly into California's rivers. These rivers became choked with sludge, raising riverbeds by dozens of feet, which caused massive floods downstream that destroyed farms. The spawning grounds for millions of salmon were completely wiped out. And to make matters worse, miners used millions of pounds of mercury to separate gold from the gravel. And here's the scary part. That mercury didn't just disappear. It washed into the waterways, settled in the sediment, and entered the food chain. It's still there today, a toxic legacy that contaminates fish and wildlife over 170 years later. The promise of gold left behind a land that was scarred, poisoned, and forever changed. The story of the gold rush is a powerful reminder that history is never simple. It's a tale of dreams and desperation, of incredible wealth and terrible injustice, of progress bought at a devastating price. If you found these forgotten parts of the story as fascinating as we do, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into history's biggest moments. And let us know in the comments. What part of this story surprised you the most? The Gold Rush era from 1848 to 1855 was far more than a simple search for treasure. It was a chaotic, transformative, and brutal chapter in American history. It sped up the nation's westward expansion, created unimaginable wealth, and forged the identity of modern California. But it also left behind a dark legacy of genocide, social chaos, and environmental ruin that we are still dealing with today. The glimmer of gold that James Marshall saw in the American River turned out to be a reflection of both the best and worst of human ambition. It was a dream for a few, a nightmare for many, and a turning point for a nation.